Hi, y'all. Welcome back to So What's Next, a production by the Young Democrats of Emory. My name is Raleigh,
I'm Ashlyn.
and today is our 10th episode. Today, we're joined by State Senator Josh McLaurin. Thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to get started.
Absolutely. Happy to be here. And my appearance is sponsored by Powerade Extra Sour, Peach Pucker. It's not actually, so I hope you guys don't get in trouble.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So we wanted to get started today just asking kind of where you got your start in politics. We have a lot of guests who are involved in the Georgia political scene. We love to talk to them about where they got started. So where did you get your start in politics? How did you become a state senator? Walk us through that process.
Sure, that's fine. And, this joke fell a little flat. So I normally start with the Trump derangement syndrome joke, but I'll go ahead and skip that for you guys. 2016, I didn't like the result of the presidential election. I don't think a lot of us did. We're Democrats, right? So I wanted to be the change. There's lots of adages about, don't just say something or don't just complain, go do something. And at the time, I had just graduated from law school 2 years prior, 2014. And so I decided I'd start running for office. And the first thing I said I was going to do is run for Congress in Tom Price's congressional district. He got tapped for HHS in 2016. I don't know if anybody watching remembers that, but that opened up a special election, U.S. House District 6 at the time. And I grew up in that district. So I thought, well, I'm a 30-year-old guy. I can do anything, right? I have no political experience. I'll just run for Congress. So I said I was going to do that. And actually, I raised a decent amount of money. I raised like 40 grand in 3 weeks in December of 2016. And there were two former state legislators also in the race who hadn't raised that much. So I was feeling pretty good. And then I started seeing on Facebook that there was a 30-year-old guy who had $250,000 in John Lewis's endorsement for that race. And at first I thought that it was made up stuff about me. I was like, I don't have all that stuff. Like, that's crazy that people are saying that. It's like a game of telephone. But it turned out that was John Ossoff, right? Wow. So I met up with him in January 2017. I'm like knocking on his skull, like, are you real? And he was like, yes, in fact, I am real. He came in a suit. I like to tell this story with his deputy finance director in a black Suburban. Trump hadn't even taken office yet. For this, this appointment had not been made. I showed up by myself in my Hyundai Sonata with some jeans on. And so I got out of that race. I was like, as 30-year-old dudes who've never run for office before go, he's probably ahead of me. So he ran that race, obviously, and was the nominee and all that. There were a handful of people at the party who were like, hey, you're not so crazy. Like, you raised a little money and you seem to be, a good team player. Why don't you run for state house? So in 2018, I qualified and ran for a North Fulton County state house seat up in Sandy Springs, Roswell, Johns Creek, District 51. Won that race, which was surprising to a lot of people, including the law firm that had just hired me. And they thought I was going to get the run out of my system and be a real lawyer. And so they were disappointed bitterly when I actually won. So I won by like 3 points, flipped a longtime Republican seat, was part of the blue wave in 2018, and was in the state house for 4 years. Democrats don't get to do a whole lot in the state legislature except make some noise and do some tactics on the floor and in committee. But I enjoyed it and decided I'd run for the state Senate when the maps got redrawn in 2021. So that's where I'm at now. And I'm running for lieutenant governor. I don't know if I can say that, but yeah, it's been a weird and wild ride. I've been elected 4 times. Didn't know I would stay in the state legislature this long. I think in part because I thought, like a lot of us, that the Trump moment was sort of like a toxic hiccup for the United States. And it turns out, so going back to that joke I make about Trump derangement syndrome, turns out it can be a disease that's subject to relapse. And so in 2024, hey, bazing, right? Felt like, look, our work here is not done. Not that the work of democracy is ever done, but sort of the like bleeding out wound, like dumpster fire situation is at least a decade-long problem. So here I am trying to do what I can to keep fighting and messaging the way Democrats need to. And that's kind of that wasn't bad. It was a 4 minutes, 5 minutes version of the story.
Yeah, so we got all the details, but we'll definitely ask some more questions about that. So I'd love to talk more about like the blue wave you kind of mentioned. So we started this podcast in January, kind of feeling hopeless, trying to find a way to discover how we can pitch in, like as Emory students, to kind of resisting America's MAGA wave. So I wanted to ask kind of what it takes to win back Georgia. And I know this is a huge question, but I'm from Tennessee, have lived there my whole life. And I think like 05, 06, Democrats lost the majority in the state legislature. And then since then, it's just kind of been impossible to gradually erode the majority of Republicans. But in Georgia, we've kind of seen Democrats slowly taking back power. I think 2014, it was in the House, it was 120 Republicans, 59 Democrats. Like 2024, it's now like 180. So how do you see What do you see that process being driven by, and how do you think Democrats can continue that and fight to get, a majority in the state house, for example?
Great question, and kind of the question.
Yeah.
If we're so formally, you'll hear the chair of the DPG, Charlie Bailey, who's doing a great job, say things like, the point of the Democratic Party is to elect Democrats. Every position up and down the ballot statewide. That's the purpose of the organization. And so, if you've got an issue with Democrats, you can show up and you can talk about it. But ultimately, if you're rallying as a Dem and you're in a Dem organization, the purpose is to elect Democrats. And again, even I am a person who, with the right pale ale and the right campfire, can imagine purposes in life that are larger or different than electing Dems. Right. But at least for the work that we do politically to organize, that's kind of the rallying point. So I want to use a metaphor of exercise, because I think that there are a lot of similarities between physical exercise and what we're doing that resonate deeply with people and hopefully can offer a little bit of hope. It is easy to sit on a couch and watch TV and eat potato chips. It is hard to get off your butt and go to the gym and put in the reps and struggle and eat the right foods and make gains of whatever kind of gains you're trying to make, right? That's hard. And so the work of democracy is hard. It is easier to destroy something than it is to build something, right? And I don't want to be too reductive, but I think it is fair to say that Republicans who are traveling under the MAGA banner, or who are, going down this road of authoritarian energy, they are more or less destroying things more than they are building things. They are hollowing out institutions, doing things like firing a bunch of people illegally, dismantling agencies without congressional authorization. What else? Gutting, the Bureau of Labor Statistics no longer has reliable jobs data. It's just so much easier to go into a china shop with a baseball bat and break everything than it is to make every individual piece of china, hang it up on the wall, get a business license, and create that business, right? It's a very intuitive metaphor. And so when it comes to exercise, the first time you go to the gym after sitting on the couch for a really long time, it sucks. It feels really bad. I joke, I was actually at Emory last time I talked about doing Orange Theory. In 2021, I worked out a lot. I don't know, since then, don't ask me. But you go the first time, you put on a little wristband, right, and you do the treadmill and you do the weights, and 20 minutes in, if you have asthma, which is me, you're like, I'm going to die and I shouldn't be here. And I need to call it right now, even though it's an hour-long class, because this is too much. But what you find very quickly is, wow, okay, the next class is a little bit easier. And by the third or fourth class, you're like, wow, the human body programmed to be quite resilient, right? Turns out if I put in the work, I could actually get somewhere. I think you can conceptualize the 2016 moment and where we are now as injuries or being sedentary for a long period of time, injuries to the body that are easy to come by. It's easy for the body to get destroyed. And then as a collective polity, to use a college word, we're all trying to pick up the pieces and figure out where do we go from here. So we're trying, the whole thing about electorates, whatever electorate shows up in the election, that's who the people are for that election. But electorates change. We are trying, if you think about it, to replace the MAGA electorate. Whatever electorate elects Donald Trump, we are working to replace that electorate with a different one. Just like when you go work out, you are trying to replace a couch body with a beach body of some kind, right? And it's discouraging. I feel like the moment we're in now is sort of we tried something, we tried to work out, we did a fad diet, we did a march on Washington, we signed up for a studio for a few classes. And then we injured our knee or something. And now we're back. We feel like we're back to square one. We feel like we're even further back than we were before, but the fundamentals have never changed. As sexy as this Instagram or social media app is, or, this new influencer, new podcast, all of these things that we think, oh, I hope that's a magic bullet. I hope that this one politician or this one idea for new media can save us from the moment. None of that changes, going back to exercise and diet, the fundamentals, which are you have to meet with people in person, which is why we're doing the first ever in-person video podcast for this podcast. We meet in person and we have to build real relationships. And before I finish this particular rant, I'll say one last thing. My favorite story on this, which I think I mentioned, I don't know if I mentioned this the last time I was at Emory, but I was in a group that was talking about organizing. How do we, kind of your big question, how do we win the state house? How do we do all the things that we want to do to elect Democrats and move the ball forward towards justice? And what kind of new and interesting organizing techniques can we use? And somebody in the room was like, well, there's this totally new thing where, you basically are like developing bonds. You're like showing up to places, you're developing bonds with people. And then over time, you can sort of move them through relation toward voting and engagement. And that's called relational organizing. And somebody in the room was like, I have a question. Are you describing friendship? And that's, I think, something that we need to be thinking about is like, we're coming back to fundamentals. We're realizing how important those are. We can't just use a cell phone to click something and then democracy, we win the day for democracy.
Yeah. And I guess on that note of relational organizing, I know that just in terms of like the numbers we've seen in picking up more seats in the state house, for example, like Atlanta and the growing metro center has been like a large portion of that. But I would love to hear kind of your thoughts on how Democrats can more effectively engage in other areas of Georgia, like have the potential to flip seats. I know that, there were even some districts in 2024 that I think Harris won or maybe was close to winning that we didn't even have like a candidate in. So how do you think that we can engage those districts, and also like what role do those play in, returning back the red?
So you said it. There's this, and it goes back, I kind of wanted to do that rant up front so I could set the stage for like, some of these answers not going to be as sexy as people want them to be. We all want to be masters of the universe who play a game of Risk and like look at where the armies are located and say, how can we get more, armies in this county? And like, we're going to decide things. But the truth is, it all comes down to the level of organization and the inspiration of those people on the ground in that district. So if your family lives there, how many are they part of the local Democratic Party? Are there organizing events? Do they register people to vote? Are there churches that are active in that area? Labor unions that are active in that area? What kinds of social bonds exist that you can go into those spaces and say, and let's also talk about who we're electing to the state house and the governor and all that. And I feel like when it comes to, you said it, there's no candidate in some of these districts because there is no hope that somebody can elect the person that they want to see. Why? Gerrymandering, right? So gerrymandering is a actual tactical tool that you can use to discourage people's engagement and investment because it looks like there's no hope. But it's also just it's the vibes. It's, are there people on the ground who are trying? And, you can't just always parachute into a community and say, hey, you should run for office. You guys should organize. Good luck. One way that you have to engage communities, if you're just showing up, if you say, I'm not from here, but I want to show up and tell you to run candidates and organize, one way to do that is to invest, is to show up with something and say, I'm not just coming here to demand energy from you. My name is Charlie Bailey. I'm the chair of the DPG, and I'm bringing you investment and money, real resources that you can use to run races. So that's one way. Or another way is to like be involved in that community. If you're a statewide candidate like me, you need to go drive to Tift County and meet with the Tift Democrats and talk to the chair about how he's been around for a decade. But, it used to be when they started out, it was 3 Democrats, and now they're up to 20 or 30 who come to a meeting, right? And tell their friends about who's running and what the issues are. So I think it takes money, obviously. It takes relational organizing, which is really just friendship. It's showing up and saying, I care about you. I want to be part of what you're doing. And I'm asking you for help and kind of the big picture and what we're doing. And so again, I don't want to give an answer that's not sexy enough, but we really all have to focus on like, who are the people we know in which places that we can strengthen our bonds with, so that when it comes time to make an ask of them or to try to connect them to a bigger picture statewide, that we are not just, it's like calling for dollars or anything else. You're not just calling the first time and saying, hey, I don't know you, but I want something from you, right? All of this is about relationships.
Yeah, and I think part of that movement is obviously your campaign for lieutenant governor. So sort of switching off to that track, I know the past 3 posts have all been Republican during their time there. So sort of how do you see your role in running this campaign as sort of being almost a figurehead of this movement? It is the statewide position instead of these local. And then sort of what is the position? I mean, lieutenant governor, a lot of people don't really know sort of what the duties entail for that. And what do you hope to do with it?
Part of my strategy on social media has been operating off the assumption that most people don't know what a lieutenant governor is. And so we've literally like gone to the Beltline and asked people, what do you know what a lieutenant governor is? They're like, not really. But so it's the second highest whatever job in the state, because if the governor steps down for any reason or vacates the position, the lieutenant governor then becomes the governor until the next election. The other thing the Constitution says about the lieutenant governor is that they're the president of the Senate. It's kind of like the vice president role federally. You got to gavel, stand up, put gavels in the Instagram videos. You got to stand up at the top of the Senate rostrum and conduct business. So you're the parliamentarian kind of. You're the chair of the organization from like a Robert's Rules perspective. Anybody out there is a procedure nerd. Well, they probably already know what a lieutenant governor is if they're a nerd. And the rest of the lieutenant governor's powers are really determined by the Senate rules. So the Senate majority every biennium, every 2 years, by majority vote, adopts a new rules package that governs, sitting down, speaking, when certain time is allocated for certain things, who's on what, how the committees are structured. And the Senate rules right now give a tremendous amount of power to the lieutenant governor to decide all the committee assignments, which bills move through the floor or not. If a Democrat wins that race, I'm just going to tell the truth. Senate Republicans, if they're in the majority, which they likely will be by 27, they're just going to strip the Senate rules and turn the lieutenant governor position into kind of just its bare constitutional form, which is you stand up there, you got a gavel. Now, they try to take the gavel away from me. I'm going to go to Supreme. I'm going to the Georgia Supreme Court. Yeah, I'm going to ask the Chief Justice what he thinks about that.
You can borrow his gavel.
Whatever they let me do. But yeah, so you stand up there and it's a bully pulpit. You have the opportunity to use your platform to send the right messages, to shape public opinion. And I think it's a super powerful role. Think about all the angst that young people, the Democratic base, progressives justifiably have about a lot of our political leadership right now, which is you're not reflecting my values, my level of urgency, the types of economic outcomes for young people, for a lot of people at the low income side of the spectrum that, stave off conditions of political instability. I mean, we've got a lot of complacent Democrats in DC, mostly DC, some at the state level, who don't see the urgency of this moment. And so I think we're right to be upset at a lot of those Democrats, but I think that reinforces how important messaging is. Some people, may expect this. I don't think we expect Hakeem Jeffries to put on brass knuckles and actually fight Mike Lawler in the hallway, right? I mean, we expect our politicians to use words to be strong and use words and ideas to build movements and to exercise strength in a system that is designed to privilege public discourse over actual violence. That's how it's supposed to work. So messaging couldn't be more important. I mean, it's in some ways people ask me LG would be a powerless job if you won. Are you okay with that? And I'm like, it still has the biggest power available to it, which is to reflect the values of the people and shape public opinion. And we've seen that matters. Why did Kilmar Abrego Garcia come back from El Salvador? He didn't come back because Trump was like, you know what? It's really mean that we sent him there, right? He came back because Chris Van Hollen, U.S. Senator from Maryland, flew to El Salvador, took pictures with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and there was a broad-based national movement in the United States to ensure his due process and bring him and hundreds of other people home. You can say the same thing about why there's not active duty Marines in the city of Chicago right now, because J.B. Pritzker has used his bully pulpit. There's nothing from a formal power perspective that he can do at the state level to stop Donald Trump from invading his city with the military. But he has very effectively wielded public opinion, earned media appearances, pretty fire social media presence. I think he's done a good job of articulating the values in a way that's very accessible to people. But that alone has been instrumental, his messaging, in showing real strength and preventing really bad outcomes from happening. So that's my message to anybody who asks, what about these state level positions that don't have as much formal power? We have got to be seeing all of these positions as opportunities to be vocal, loud, out front, fighting, so that the Trump administration can't get away with a bunch of bullshit. And so the values of people in the silent majority, I don't want to use that term, but it is kind of useful. There's a lot of people in Georgia who want the abortion ban reversed, who want common sense gun regulation, Medicaid to be expanded, economic development that isn't just sprinkling incentives on corporations, but is focusing on working people. There's all of that latent public opinion, and we need the leaders in place to give expression to that and to reflect that. And so I think I answered both of your questions, because of the LG question and then sort of what you said before that.
Yeah. And I mean, at this point, you've been in both the House and the Senate, and you talked a little bit about how Senate Republicans would likely strip that lieutenant governor position of sort of its bigger powers. So during your time in both of those positions, how have you seen those roadblocks? What have been the biggest barriers you've had to personally passing legislation, to actually getting things done that, people often don't know about happening in the government?
If you're a Democrat in a Republican controlled General Assembly, you're not going to get a bill unless the powers that be bless you somehow. And there are different paths to getting blessed by a Republican majority, right? One path is you do everything they say all the time and you shut up and you're a useful Democrat, right? Another path is you're Scott Holcomb and you have a common sense bill on preserving rape kits to be tested. And the Republicans don't want to give it to you until you go on national news, Samantha Bee's a TV show, and shame them for not doing it. Then they have to let you do it, right? So there's different pathways to being successful. My pathway has been so I got a booting regulation passed. Car booting, I have to enunciate very clearly, booting. But basically the predatory booting industry is one of the worst industries in Georgia. Have you ever, either of you had your car booted before? Sure. No. All right. Well, fight the power. But no, but car booting is uniquely abusive because it's a $75 fine that a booter themselves can impose. The property owner may not even be part of it. So unlike towing, where the property owner has to call every time there's a car in violation and say, hey, I need you to bring the truck out. With booting, the guy just sits there and he waits. If your tire's over the line, if you don't have your pass displayed exactly right, or you go into the wrong store in a commercial lot, the booter will be like, too bad. And sometimes they just make it up. It's not even a real violation. They throw the boot on the car and you can't leave. You're trapped until you pay $75. People may contest it later, but it's usually too much effort and they let it go. So it's very predatory. I passed the first ever statewide regulation of that industry. So I'm very excited about that. There were 2 House Republicans whose bill I had to ride on to put my amendment onto their bill for it to happen. And that doesn't happen unless the House Republicans have a good relationship with me. And it doesn't happen unless they agree with the underlying issue or the regulation I want to do. So I had to work across the aisle with them to do that, which again, it's complicated. I mean, if you're somebody who can't even talk to your family at Thanksgiving because your family is so MAGA or something, it's hard to imagine being in the same room as people who support Donald Trump and having friendships or relationships or working with them almost to any degree. It's very challenging. But I think it just comes down to a balance and a perspective of saying it's all one country. We're not getting a national divorce. Anybody who talks about that is making stuff up. And we have to confront the reality that we're here with these people and we have to work with them, right? Now, should that go as far as never using your voice for good and complying with whatever the Republican Speaker of the House tells you to do? No, I think that's a bridge too far. And I've spoken out against Democrats who have behaved that way. But it's a balance and you got to fight for your district and constituents, both in the words you use, but also trying your best to deliver some results. And look, maybe Republicans will never give you a hearing, but it's still important to file the bills that you think mark the progress that you would like to see in the state. Nobody nails that balance perfectly. Everybody kind of has their own approach to it. But I think at the root of it is a recognition that if you really believe in democracy and you really believe we're all one country, you can't just go to the Capitol and throw bombs rhetorically or otherwise and say, you're not agreeing with me or you're different from me, therefore you're immoral and bad and I won't talk to you. That's just not how government works.
Yeah. And then I guess on that question of kind of just getting legislation passed, what sort of challenges do you face by a Republican majority? I know with like the booting bill, I was following it closely just because I, was excited by it. There's a lot of messaging I was following, but I know like even that legislation was an amendment. There was an amendment to it, if I remember correctly. Like what other challenges do you face just not being in the majority?
Oh, all kinds of stuff. I mean, you don't set the agenda. So I'll give you a really good example. There was a resolution to approve of the building of the Public Safety Training Center, AKA Cop City, this Republicans brought it. I want to say it was during a special session, like 2023. Gleefully, they brought this resolution because they couldn't wait to see how Democrats were going to vote on it because they knew that the base was very activated saying, we're very skeptical of this training center. We don't like what, Atlanta's doing with the forest and, a lot of talking points. Well, my position was, if you actually knew which trees were affected, it was like 20 to 30-year-old newer growth trees and not like the old growth that are actually like the legacy, signature trees. And the fact that if you look at an aerial map, like 20, 30 years ago, it was brown. It's like, again, new growth forest. On top of the fact that, local communities had been engaged, the Atlanta police, they do have some use of force rules that make them, they're at least not far behind the national standards for trying to reduce use of force incidents against citizens. you look at the whole picture and you look at the fact that the fire trucks were doing donuts in commercial parking lots that they were renting because there was nowhere else to go. And that the, city of Atlanta was renting a bunch of space from other jurisdictions to do the same type of urban drills that the city aspect. There's a lot of context, but the city had not done a good enough job on comms of communicating what was happening. And more importantly, and this is much more important, the state level reaction to the protesters was absolutely absurd and violent and crazy. So RICO charges, the use of the Georgia State Patrol, arresting bail fund managers, all this stuff to me was beyond the pale. And to justify all that, these cronies like Chris Carr and, folks who just don't really care about the citizenry were using the label domestic terrorism to describe bail fund managers and protesters who are out like at a dance festival in the forest. Totally absurd stuff. And we know a Fulton County judge just agreed that using RICO charges for that is completely absurd. Okay, now I've teed that up. The resolution was a totally garden variety, just like vanilla resolution that's like, it's good to build facilities for police. They need training, stuff that like, as an elected Democrat, I agree with. They're like, okay, we need to train our police. We need to pay them enough to where, people don't join the force just so they can beat up on people. Like we want it to be a professional job. But there was a paragraph or two that was like, and we condemn the domestic terrorism that's happening in response to the facility. And I was like, well, hell no.
Yeah.
I'm not going to vote for a resolution that does the most dangerous possible posturing relative to people exercising their First Amendment rights. So I voted no on the resolution. And I was one of a small number of Democrats who voted. I mean, none of the Republicans voted no. They all voted yes. But a majority of Democrats also voted yes, because on balance, they wanted to show their support for the training center. I was one of the ones who was furthest out on the progressive side saying, we are steamrolling over what's happening with these protesters and just not listening at all to the government overreach and marking what's happening if we agree that domestic terrorism is the right label. But do I get to say to the majority, hey, this is kind of a cheap shot, guys. Like, you should take this domestic terrorism language out. They're not going to do that. That's the whole point. The whole point is for them to stick something in that is objectionable to me so they can get me to vote no. And then what do? They'll say this about me in November. Josh McLaurin voted against a resolution approving of funding police. Like they're going to make it into some big defund police issue. So when you have the power to set the agenda, you have the power to essentially force members of the minority to take these really awkward or uncomfortable votes by using what's called a wedge issue to try to highlight things that they have a conscience about. And look, I'm not afraid of that stuff. Like, I will defend my record, but I'll tell you, there may or may not be people at the Atlanta Police Department who won't, return a phone call if they see that I vote no on a resolution like that. Right. And so I think, again, it's having a conscience. The majority tries as much as possible to make that costly to have a conscience, but you kind of just have to do it anyway.
And then I guess on the flip side of that, kind of, what would it mean for Democrats to start closing the gap in the House and the Senate and forcing wedge issues on Republicans? I know, I remember being at the Capitol during tort reform and just how close the vote was in the House, and how, a lot of Republicans even voted against legislation just because of, I'm not exactly sure why, but I think that it's, some constituents or personal reasons they wanted to vote against it. So I guess what would it mean materially for Democrats to start, closing the gap in the House and the Senate, I guess?
Because you don't have the agenda setting power writ large, it's not really practicable for Democrats to put Republicans to wedge issues. Now, you can try to tee these up with media. So you can use earned media, social media, whatever, to try to force Republicans to respond to something. I'll give you an example. The Hyundai plant raid by ICE, right? Brian Kemp did not make a statement for 5 full days after that raid on his signature economic development project. So Rua and I, State Representative Rua Roman, thought it might be fun to go to the Capitol and to record ourselves opening doors of the Capitol looking for Brian Kemp. So we did. We went around the Capitol. We were like, where is he? We don't know. He works here, but we can't find him. It's been 5 days. He hasn't made a statement. I don't want to take credit, but Brian Kemp did release a statement, I think the very next day for the first time. So that's you can think of that like a wedge. That's like a limited type of agenda setting power. Now, structurally, formally, House Democrats do not have an agenda setting power. Senate Democrats, however, do have a limited agenda setting power, and that is the floor amendment procedure. So in the state House, Democrats or Republicans, neither party is allowed to offer floor amendments to legislation being debated on the House floor. In the Senate, it's completely different. Any Senate member can introduce any number of amendments that modify the legislation any way they want, and they can force a vote by the entire Senate on every amendment. That's agenda setting power because you force the vote on the issue you chose, right? So I'll give you an example. Kim Jackson and I, Senator Madam Whip Kim Jackson, we were up against a governor's gang bill. So when the governor has a bill, it sails through, nobody changes it. Everybody votes down the amendments because the governor wants it a certain way. It's the governor's bill. So the governor's bill came through. And I say that because you would expect if we were to offer an amendment on the governor's bill that every Republican would vote it down literally without even thinking because they're just like, I'm not voting to modify the governor's bill. Yeah. Well, the bill was to increase mandatory minimums and penalties for people who recruit minors into gangs. Sounds good on paper if you like that kind of thing, like use of law and order, criminal justice to try to further punish people. A lot of times that doesn't work. But in this case, the bill was so broad that it could have encompassed minors who recruit other minors into gangs. So potentially would have put serious felony liability on kids. Mm-hmm. It gets worse. The definition of gang was so broad that it could include sex trafficking rings. So if you have a minor who's a sex trafficking victim, and this is very common, by the way, if you talk to the experts in the sex trafficking area, they will tell you sometimes minors have quotas. It's really dark stuff, but to lessen their own load for a quota, they might recruit another vulnerable minor in for the protection racket and to reduce the number of people that they have to attend to, right? The governor's bill does criminalize those children. Those sex trafficking victims could be charged under that bill. So Kim and I introduced an amendment to exclude from prosecution under the bill all sex trafficking victims. So if you were to vote no on that, you're essentially saying, yeah, I want the bill and I want it to apply to sex trafficking victims who are already being victimized. Right. They could be charged with felonies. And Kim and I were like, surely with the, First Lady Marty Kemp, with her emphasis on being there, supporting sex trafficking victims, surely you guys don't want to expand felony liability for victims. And I'll tell you, the vast majority of the Republican caucus voted no on the amendment because they're well-trained. But there were 4 Republicans, if I recall correctly, some of whom were the smartest in the Senate, who voted yes on the amendment because they were not going to be caught dead on the record saying, yes, I think that sex trafficking victims should be charged with a felony for trying to survive, right? So again, if you can strategically, and we had one, I won't keep going on too long, but there was a DEI bill that tried to ban all controversial topics in schools. So we introduced a floor amendment as Democrats that said, okay, well, whatever you ban, you can't ban the following discussions. The Civil War was the predominant cause of slavery. Evolutionary biology is a scientific fact. Oh, and the Holocaust happened. And we wanted to wedge them with that because can you imagine, they've got their DEI hobby horse or the hammer that they're beating. And it's like, are you really going to vote for, against an amendment that says that we can do Holocaust education? At some point, you've got to test how absurd their bullshit is. So yeah, I think that's a really fun lane that for Democrats, we've found some real spots to fight and and when we introduced that amendment the first time on crossover day, they adjourned rather than continue to debate the bill.
Sounds like something happening nationally right now. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was spicy, and they brought the bill back. They did pass it out of the Senate on sine die, but they changed their strategy up. They found a procedural trick to try to exclude all our floor amendments at the same time. So we never actually took votes on them. So they found their way to weasel out of the vote. But yeah, I mean, and this is a metaphor, right? We can all of us find these opportunities to force the issue, to bring, can I say something that sounds crazy and controversial, but like Charlie Kirk. The thing that he's getting so much credit for right now, and he shouldn't get much credit at all, but the credit that he does get is whatever he was doing, he knew how to grab eyeballs. Like he knew how to force an issue. And granted, I think he did it in really belligerent and awful ways, but he was able to get people to get off their couch and engage each other, even if it was like the lowest common denominator of interaction. So Democrats' challenge is like, all right, avoiding, like we're not going to be assholes, but how can we engage people in a way that grabs attention, that's engaging, that gets people off of a smartphone and in person to really interact with one another? And again, it's easier to do that by being an asshole, which is why the TPUSA project is as big as it is. But we have to find our way to do our framing and wedge to respond to that.
Well, I think you bring up a good point of sort of this political fatigue that I feel like the Democratic Party has struggled with for a long while now that we're just in a lull. Things are going bad and everyone is like, okay, well, what are we gonna do now? And okay, and it's just sort of there. And I think you mentioned it earlier, but sort of building these coalitions, sort of energizing people. I mean, your campaign for lieutenant governor, it seems to be sort of playing really into that, like, let's energize people. So do you see this as sort of the role that the Democratic Party just in general needs to take on to try and, get people to become more engaged, to sort of try and lift up people from this lull we're in?
I think that's a great way of putting it. It's just the words you chose. It's about uplifting people. It is kind of a lull. It's a low energy. It's a slump. It's depressive. It's tired. And the uplift is what we need. I've been saying a lot that our big paradox is, how do you keep people engaged in a way that's not depleting to them?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like staring at the sun. You need eclipse glasses to stare at the sun, because if you stare at the sun, your eyeballs, your corneas burn. And it feels like watching the news is like staring at the sun.
There are some days I'm like, okay, what are the headlines?
100%. I once saw an episode of This American Life taped live in New York City back in like 2015 or 16. And this was when Trump derangement was in like full swing, right? Ira Glass was on stage and he was like, sometimes I find, I wake up in the morning and I just Google the word Trump, because I know whatever comes out, it's just going to be completely maddening and ridiculous. And he's right. And it's been that way for a decade. And so one way, if you imagine a Venn diagram of like things that keep people paying attention, and then over here, things that don't deplete people to the point of being totally exhausted or depressed. What's the overlap for those circles? Humor is one. It's not the only one. Inspiration, James Tallarico, like singing the sweet song of the Old and New Testaments combined. I don't know. No, but he's great. Like, he's a very effective messenger. And he has an answer to that. It's like almost like an Obama style inspiration. But Obama needs to learn how to pronounce his name. Yes, which is funny. And James Tallarico posted, he can call me whatever he wants, which is funny. But yeah, there's different pathways. I think one way to think about the difference between us, because there is a double standard. Republicans go into a china shop with a baseball bat, they break everything, and then they wait for applause, right? And Democrats are like, you have to get your business license and put each piece of china up on the shelf,
Right.
And so we are held to a double standard because we are the party of progress. We are the party of not the status quo. We want to change. We want to do something different than what's not been working. We want to move the ball towards equality and opportunity. And so we are held to a higher standard. So while they can organize their people by just sounding the same note and the same gong, Donald Trump rules, MAGA, blah, 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 right? They just have to say the same thing to organize. We have a different burden. We cannot use the same voice because we recognize the value and the strength of diversity. Zoran Mamdani is not the same as James Tallarico, is not the same as Georgia Democrats. And unfortunately, you go into like the Zen Master's chambers to ask like, oh, Zen Master, what should my Democratic voice be? And he's like, I don't know. Like, you have to figure it out. And that's the burden. It's on you. Nobody's going to give you a script on how to be whatever our party demands. And in fact, it's the scripts on what we are supposed to be that everyone's intuitively rejecting. So this is the challenge. Find your own voice. Find a voice that engages people without depleting or depressing them so that they stay uplifted and they stay engaged. And then keep using that voice consistently to build momentum and to kind of hammer the same. At the end of Zoran's campaign, what was he doing? Freeze the, it's call and response at a concert because his messaging was so consistent. So yeah, I want my LG campaign to look something like that. I mean, you can't, I made a few dad jokes on Blue Sky about how like Georgia is not New York, It's like Jeff Foxworthy jokes. Like, everyone says do a Mamdani in Georgia, but, and then like the joke, but Waffle House is not going to lower their prices to $8 for the All-Star Special. But it's hard to walk from Blue Ridge to Valdosta, right? Like, and so I think the LG race I'm trying to put together is really focused on finding joy. I want youth voters to feel engaged. I want people who connect to the campaign to feel like that there's at least some kind of outlet in an elected office or in a campaign for elected office that espouses the type of values and uses the type of energy that intuitively we feel like is going to get us out of this moment. And look, LG, it's not the sports car. It's like the little sidecar, right? So it's not, doesn't have the veto power. It's not as big and fancy as some of the bigger races. But I think, whether we're running for dog catcher, it doesn't matter. We should be modeling the type of politics that we think are going to reinvigorate young people and the whole electorate for a brand new era of politics. I don't know what's going to happen. But I do think that if Trump goes the way of the dodo and he leaves some way or another, and we can prevent MAGA forces from taking over the next administration, if we can get real justice and accountability for all the illegal dismantling of government, the ICE abuses, everything that's happening right now, like what we tried to do with Jan 6, but didn't quite have the political will to do. If we can turn that corner, even if it takes 5-10 years, I really think we're going to see what a lot of scholars call the third Reconstruction, which is now we have a new country. We're starting from scratch.
Right.
You know, we're going to take the Constitution. We're not going to like throw it out, but we want to amend it. We want to change the way the campaign finance works. You know, we want to maybe have proportional representation and not do this like two-party system that doesn't reflect the degree of diversity in our values and political positions. You know, maybe some sort of dramatic action to make sure that we're good players on climate change. But now is not the time to stop thinking big. We absolutely have to think big. I think the issue is we have to learn a level of pain tolerance and a level of patience so that those big ideas, which we can hold in reserve, that we can fight for a moment when eventually the spring comes and the little green twigs start to appear in the dirt, right? But it's winter right now. It's absolutely winter.
And before we get to kind of our last segment, I do have to ask, you mentioned the future of the MAGA party. I know you have personally known someone who may be, you know, inheriting that party. And maybe
the whole party?
You know, Vice President JD Vance.
Yeah.
I have friends, I wouldn't even call them friends really, but acquaintances who are kind of obsessed with his, you know, ability to communicate and are just kind of enthralled by him. How do you explain kind of his turn from this person who seems to be really care about his community, kind of like, you know, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, to, you know, Trump's secondhand man? How do you kind of explain?
Well, first, I want some kind of explanation of these people who are supposedly enthralled with him. That's kind of remarkable.
I mean, every time
young
I have
people?
yes, young people.
Wow.
Every time I have a conversation with them, I'm kind of bewildered, and I just try and like, you know, see it from their perspective, like what about him is so captivating. And I mean, I think like they really enjoyed his debate with Governor Tim Walz. Just thought that he was like a very well-spoken communicator and could, you know, get across ideas eloquently, and they enjoyed that and kind of they thought that was appealing. But, you know, whenever I talk to them, I try and explain to them just how, you know, incredible a lot of his turn has been, and kind of how he's, to me, seems like a very power hungry kind of politician.
Sure.
But
yeah, it's interesting. I think there are a couple things about JD that make him strong and a couple things about him make him weak. And I'll address the sort of turncoat issue. One of the things that makes him strong is that he uses a deep well of anger, like real anger that he actually has, to animate a lot of what he says. It's like the press will ask him some question he's annoyed by, and he'll do the little like the little fake laugh. But it'll be the kind of like Denzel Washington laugh, you know, in a movie where he's about to kill somebody, right? It's like, oh, my man. You can tell he's mad, and nothing makes him more mad than people pointing that out. So like there's a journalist who asked him one time, like, what makes you happy? And he was like, his anger translator was said like, that's such a bullshit question. And you guys, you know, are reprehensible for not asking me about policy, whatever. But that anger animates him. And I think that because people can see it's real anger, that he gets somehow points on the rubric for authenticity, because he's just like Trump brings his authentic, smarmy asshole self to politics. JD brings his real anger. So when he lashes out, it's really who he is. I also think that in some respects, not all, he's patient. He is willing to put up with a lot of bullshit, to wait for a moment when the time is right to get what he wants. And that's no different from, you know, in principle at the molecular level, what I was saying a second ago, about how all of us have to be willing to not get what we want immediately. Like if you like, I talked to an abolitionist the other day. Like I said a bunch about Cop City, right? And I hope that anybody watching is not like sell out, but maybe they are. But I talked to an abolitionist in the last year where we talked about like, okay, 500 years from now, you want the world to look this way. But like 10 years from now, what if it looked this way? And there's almost no difference between the way they want it to look and the way I want it to look. More money for mental health services and diversion, less use of incarceration to try to solve social ills. Like there's a lot of reform work we can do that we just have to be patient for whatever goals we really have. So I think JD has some of that. Now his weaknesses are, number one, and this is trauma-based. Like, you know, people need to go to therapy for a reason, like, because there's parts of you don't have access to unless you can like do the work. I think he's lost access to his empathy. because I think it got burned off. I don't know if it was his childhood trauma or like a lot of stuff that happened to him, but he's incapable of accessing that unless it's for his in-group, right? If it's like one of his buds, it's one thing. But he can't, fathom showing any sort of empathy or holding any sort of space, to use a Gen Z expression, for his opponent. Right. And if anything, it just triggers him to do the opposite. Like, no, if you are telling me that you're vulnerable and you need my empathy, that's going to make me double my attacks on you because you're just trying to manipulate me. So that's a weakness. And there's some things where he's not patient, where he is impulsive. He wants that release of, I want to violate taboos, I want to break things, and that's going to be, that's going to pay off or make me feel better. So I think the reason that he did a turnabout is because he realized that, it's a mix of these forces, right? That he could be patient enough to wait for a new status or better status within the regime that he didn't expect to win. He expected Hillary to win. So he thought his role was going to be to go to a bunch of polite Democratic or moderate Republican dinner parties and be like, Trump is so awful. I'm so glad Hillary won. He thought he was going to be running that circuit. So now he says, okay, well, I can find my place in the new regime and I'm patient and I'm willing to figure that out. But he also realized that he could violate taboos the same way that Trump and MAGA people are and gain status because of that. So he was gleefully going on Fox News in 2021 saying, childless cat ladies and blah, 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 just a bunch of, violative of taboos BS, because he knew that that was like sugar. It was like candy to the team that was ascending into power. And he, I guess, kissed enough butt and, got in close enough with Donald Trump Jr. and ran that media circuit well enough and, combined that with his book. And Mitch McConnell was already recruiting him potentially to run for U.S. Senate as early as, I think, 2016. And he passed, because he didn't quite have his lane yet. But this is just like any movie about like human agency and free will. Like, he had the ability to do something different. He could have worked on himself, found ways to resolve the anger that aren't becoming leader of the free world and, blowing up a bunch of Venezuelan fishermen. But instead, he chose the path of aggression and in-group, out-group exclusion, and violence, ultimately. And so, I hope if I'm ever black bagged, you don't hear from me again. I hope this serves as some sort of record of, my views on a number of issues. But yeah, like I just think, ultimately the judgment on him is cowardice. It's shame that, we all want karma to be fast, and it is fast in the Trump era. But it may be that JD lives his entire life without ever feeling one bit of cost whatsoever for betraying his own internal sense of principles and conscience. But I believe in karma. And I don't think that a human being can walk this earth and make the kind of calculation that he did without creating some kind of damage that ends up coming back around to him. And so that may not be much consolation to your viewers, but I do think that we should all be confident that at the end of the day, it is slow and painful and sometimes or thankless work to build the China shop, but there's no other way to live. And even if we wanted there to be an alternative, if we wanted there to be an easier way to do it, there's just not. And it won't be gratifying to try anything else. So we just need to commit ourselves to, come back around to the beginning, the fundamentals of doing democracy day by day.
I think a really good example of that was Deborah Shigley's campaign. Just happened. She did lose, but I think it was really inspiring to see the amount of turnout she was able to generate and the amount that she was able to overperform in her extremely gerrymandered district and just sort of that headway. Yes, it was still a loss, but the headway that she was able to make. And I think that speaks to a lot of what you've been talking about. It's not a battle of sprinting across the finish line. We're fighting for every inch here, and every inch that we can gain is going to get us closer to that finish line.
Yeah, and I wish I really can't stress this enough that like everybody thinks there's a silver bullet to win the day, and there's just not. I can tell you from, my position of experience, like I'm in the state legislature. Like I have, one of the positions in the state that's close. Like we have got John Ossoff, Raphael Warnock, and then as far as elected Dems go, it's like the Senate Dems and the House Dem caucuses in terms of who we've got at the state level. So I'm as close to the front line, I feel like, as you can be in terms of state government. And I'm telling you, when we want to make courageous choices, when we want to act in ways that are strong, that set the tone, that shape public opinion, we are completely powerless to do that. unless we have an army of people behind us who are showing up to the Capitol, who are appearing on media with us, protesting. No kings is a phrase that doesn't really move things unless 10, 15 million people show up, which is why you've got Republicans, Mike Johnson and others who are like, oh, it's Antifa. Oh, they love Hamas. They hate America. They have to do that because they got no juice. They got nothing else to say.
Yeah.
But that's not because individual politicians show up for those things. It's because people show up en masse. Our power truly is derived from people standing behind us who give us that momentum. So, it's the whole never doubt the ability of a small group of people to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. That's not just like a feel-good statement for people to be like, oh, it's okay that you don't have power. Here's your consolation prize. Truly, if you go into a space like the one where I go fight and you don't have popular sentiment behind you, it's a badge. It's a badge and it's a TV hit, but it does nothing. Right. And we're seeing that. We're seeing that now with Democrats trying to go on TV and saying Trump is an authoritarian. And everyone's being like, we need to see real inspiration. We need to have a population that's motivated to come out and do this fight. Or else the talking heads at the very top just don't have anything going for them. So this game of inches, right? I can't stress enough that it's not like you're choosing between a game of inches and a game of feet or yards. There is no game of feet or yards.
Yeah.
It does not exist. There is only a game of inches. And then like any Aesop's fable, after you've baked the bread, everyone's like, oh, there's bread. And it was so easy to make. And it's like, no, the stages where I made this, where nobody wanted to help, that were thankless, that was when we built it through inches. And now what you see is a mile. But that was because we built 5,280 feet and 12 inches per feet. And maybe you weren't there when we built them, but that was the work that was required.
Yeah, I think it's a great message to end on. Ashley, if you have anything else.
No, I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show today. We think we've had a great discussion. We really appreciate you being here.
Thank you very much. And remember to drink Powerade, extra sour, peach puck.
Yes, that's right. And we will see y'all next time. Look out for a new episode coming soon. See ya.